Today, our guest is Laura Petiford. She's a licensed marriage and family therapist and co-owner of Collaborative Counseling in Fairfield, Connecticut. Today, we are discussing relationships, family systems, and how to build good relationships. You are trained in systemic thinking. Can you explain to us what that exactly is?
Sure. So systemic thinking is based on systems theory. And systems theory is a framework of thinking about the world in terms of different systems interacting with each other. So, how that relates to a family is I think of an individual and can only really understand them in the context of a family. So, we're all members of numerous systems. Families are a system, our workplaces are a system, any kind of group can be a system. And we only can understand individual behavior in the context of what's going on in the rest of that system.
How is how we see ourselves impacted by our family of origin?
Yeah, the family of origin is really the
And how does that impact your theory or the systemic system?
systemic. Yeah, so it's really the first system that we ever encounter is our families. And so how we are treated, what we observe, any roles that we might take on in that family, those all become part of how we see ourselves over the course of time. We integrate that experience, it becomes our normal. And so I know we're going to talk about dysfunctional families at some point today,
Sure.
but certainly when we have an unhealthy family system, it can really negatively impact how we view ourselves. And no family is perfectly healthy, right? It's all on a
Of
spectrum.
course. Right.
But
Nobody's the Brady Bunch.
no, you're right. And we could probably even look at that and see ways in which that wasn't a particularly or a completely healthy family. But we carry that with us the way we experienced our
Let's talk
families.
about how we get education about relationships. How does that happen?
Well, for most of us, it is again how we experienced our families. I don't, at least I didn't receive any education other than deciding I wanted to be a therapist and really studying this sort of thing. The only relationship education I got was actually being in one. And the first relationships we're in are in our families. So when we observe how our parents treat one another, we learn about what our ideas of marriage might be. The way we interact with our siblings often replicates how we treat our peers when we're adults. So these relationships that we experience in our family of origins, we carry aspects of them with us through our entire lives.
For those that were educated in disturbance, raised with violence or addiction in families, how do you learn something different from your point of reference that was your normal?
Well, some people don't learn anything any differently. I think there has to be a desire to want to engage in life differently. If perhaps you're having relationships that aren't working out well, or you're suffering from anxiety or depression, or something in your life isn't going well, there has to be a desire on the part of the individual to take a look and say, "Hey, things aren't going well for me. I'm going to face what happened in my past." We talk a lot about trauma now. Take a look at what happened in the family of origin, maybe get a context of understanding for why we might be having the struggles that we're having, and then be intentional about learning how to do it differently.
What are the biggest issues and challenges in families today?
From my perspective, the biggest challenge of a family is that tension that is created between allowing every member of a family to be an individual and yet to maintain cohesiveness as a group, the family. And and some parents can be it can be threatening, it can be concerning, it can be scary to have a child that is very different maybe from how we are. And so it is a big challenge to figure out how to nurture that individual, let them be who they are and remain and keep the cohesion of the family together. So that tension and straddling that is, I think, a big challenge. And there's one more, if that I think matters today, and that's culturally. Um, there's this image we talked about the Brady Bunch earlier of what we think a perfect family is supposed to look like, and so I think oftentimes people get more concerned about what things are looking like and how they're reflected outwards instead of what they feel like being a member of that family.
In today's society, where divorce rates are up and a lot of people are raised in what's, and I don't like using the term, but it's a common term, a broken
Yeah.
family. And I don't like that term. There should
Yeah.
be a different term because I don't know if you agree with me. I think families are what they are. They're what you make them to be.
Yeah, I don't think divorce is what breaks them necessarily.
Right.
Mhm.
How would you address a family, if you will, that has divorced and or separated?
As is often the case with dealing with family issues, with mental health issues, because that really comes under that umbrella. The things that are looking badly or that are looking broken, like divorce, are really symptomatic or can be symptomatic of something else. So when a family or when parents or a couple decide that they're going to divorce and there are children involved, and even if there aren't children, if there's extended family, I think it's incumbent upon the couple to set the tone for how this is going to go. So, too often these situations become contentious and they become adversarial because there's property being divided up and there are all kinds of things that are occurring. But if that couple can remain focused on what I think is the most important thing, which is retaining a sense of um, cohesion and community, despite the fact that there's going to be a divorce, then I think that couple sets the tone that makes it easier for children to do well through that process and even the extended family too.
Does that dovetail into what you've said, which is reflection of how things appear is not a reflection of how things are felt?
Well, let's use an affair for an example. Oftentimes, the person who has the affair is vilified, that we see that and them as the problem instead of, and certainly it's not, um, it's a breach in a relationship, so it's not a preferable way in most circumstances of expressing a discontent in a relationship, but it is a symptom of something bigger that's going on. And so while it might look like the problem, it's and it is a problem. I'm not trying to say that it shouldn't be addressed, but it is also an indication that there's something felt going on in that relationship that isn't working out.
Let's talk about roles in alcoholic and dysfunctional families.
Yeah. Yeah, there's I can't remember who the theorist was, but there have been a number of roles that have been identified, and mostly it's thought of in terms of addictive family systems. But there is the addict themselves, who everybody kind of organizes around. And roles are then adopted in order to relieve stress and try and make that family stay together. One of the things home systems theory is based upon is maintaining homeostasis, which means trying to keep that system together no matter what. So people will adopt different roles in order to relieve stress and make that work. So in a dysfunctional family system, around the addict, you might have the caretaker, who is the person who is not holding the addict responsible for behaviors or problems they might be causing as a result of the addiction. There can often be a golden child or the hero, somebody who is uber responsible and is
Or the scapegoat.
and then, yes, and then the scapegoat is the exact opposite of that, right? The person who's vilified and blamed.
Right.
Um, There is also can be a mascot, which is comic relief, the person who takes on the role of being the family comedian. And I'm not sure if I forgot any of them. I think that's it. 5. Yeah.
Okay. So, what are the roles played in healthy families?
Well, I don't think that there are roles in healthy families, because roles really indicate that there is a script and there's something that you're supposed to be saying and a way you're supposed to be acting. Um, so in healthy families, as we talked about a little earlier, you get to be yourself. You get to be an individual and you get to be celebrated for that. Um, so roles in families, I don't think in healthy families that they really are present.
So, they're basically non roles.
Yeah, there are jobs and responsibilities that people have in families. Parents have particular responsibilities. Kids have responsibilities or to be learning, going to school, but not necessarily roles.
Let's talk about boundary issues. What is a healthy boundary?
So, a healthy boundary is when we put limits around ourselves, when we're able to set limits. You can kind of think of them like fences in that they separate us from others. So, we can put limits around our time, we put limits around our emotional energy, but they really keep us safe and keep us functioning in a healthy way.
How do we set a healthy boundary with an unhealthy person?
Yeah, it's a challenge because what happens, even if you set a firm boundary, an unhealthy person, um, i- they tend to not have good boundaries or maybe are boundaryless. And so, whether they mean to or not, they will consistently push up against that boundary and require you to continue to hold it. So, you have to persevere, you have to be tenacious and continue to hold that boundary. Regardless of how the other person is trying to push it or move it.
What's a good description, in your experience, of a good parent?
I think that number one, they recognize uh, the magnitude of the role that they have in the life of their children. It's a very powerful position. And there are approaches to it that we've learned can be healthier than other approaches. And there's a distinction between being authoritative versus being authoritarian. And an authoritative parent will work on creating those boundaries and also setting limits with their child and helping them learn how to work within limits and also maintain a really strong connection. And that's opposed to an authoritarian parent who's really focused on discipline and control. So, a good parent recognizes that their kids benefit from having limits set and maintaining connection with them. I think we've all seen parents who are more friends with their kids than parents, and that's a focus on maintaining the connection piece, but not really working on helping to set limits.
So, that would be more of an authoritative parent than an authoritarian parent?
Well, it's actually another category because they're not really focused on discipline, really. They're wanting to maintain connection at any cost. So while it sounds like it might be nice and cozy and comfy, it's not good for the child because they don't learn how to set limits, and particularly emotional limits, which can be problematic and maybe make them vulnerable to being taken advantage of in circumstances in life and even in adulthood.
So, that brings me back to what we originally talked about and mentioned, the Brady Bunch show, which was the show regarding the quintessential perfect family, supposedly. I watched it when I was younger. I'm sure you watched
Yes,
it.
yep.
Uh, and quite frankly, I was like, Mom, Dad, why don't we live like this in utopia and everything is great? And uh, Greg Brady goes, steals the car and crashes through the house and he gets grounded for 2 weeks. My father would have destroyed me. But what are your thoughts on that show and the reality of it, and what the outcome or the optics are on that?
Yeah, we all wanted to belong to the Brady Bunch family, right? But it's a depiction of a perfect family. For instance, the storyline, the plot is that both of the parents lost spouses, and yet we never really see that enter into the picture at all. There's no grieving, there's no well, mom used to do it this way or dad used to do it this way. And in reality, blended families are, that's one of the most challenging things emotionally and in all kinds of ways for people to move through, whether it be from divorce or death. But blending two different families, that's a challenging thing. And they don't depict that at all in the television show.
So the two genesis of that show are the Mr. and Mrs. Brady
Mhm.
type of thing, and then obviously the kids. Uh, what is the job of a good spouse in today's environment?
Yeah, well, I think that is subjective, right? Because relationships, marriages can look lots of different ways to different people. And so, um, what there are marriages that are open. So fidelity isn't, or sexual exclusivity isn't a piece of those particular marriages. There are marriages where people don't live in the same, share the same living space. That's happening more and more, where people live separately. That's kind of one of the phenomenon from the pandemic that I think that occurred. People recognizing that they wanted more space. So really, I think you have to ask yourself, what is it I'm looking for in a partner? What's important to me? And that description will vary from person to person.
So we graduated from the Brady Bunch, which is the 2 point, well, in their case, the 2.6 nuclear family, to something that is a mishmash, and let's make it work. And if it's healthy and there are boundaries, as you said, healthy boundaries, then it works. Is that what you're kind of suggesting?
Yeah, I mean, I think the television show didn't really let us have a window on anything that would have been significant emotionally. You mentioned I don't remember that particular episode, but you mentioned Greg driving through. And so there was probably some sort of consequence. Um, but we don't see things like, is there a member of the family that might not be heterosexual? Is there a member of the family? We see Cindy having a disability and having a speech impediment. I think she maybe dealt with a little bit of bullying, but we don't really get to see the family go through any kind of adversity. So it's,
And that
well,
was probably by design,
yeah.
and they didn't want to mix in the other realities of life that existed then and certainly exist now, but now they're more in the open.
Absolutely. And I think we have the phenomenon now of reality TV where we
Sure.
see all kinds of things being played out and we live vicariously with that and can't wait for the drama. But at that era, it was about depicting, something that was more perfect, I think. So presumably, did they have good boundaries? I mean, it's really hard for us to know because we didn't really see them go up against any kind of particular challenges that are typical in a family.
So, what would your best advice be as a professional in this field to give to couples, especially young couples, right?
Mhm.
So, usually when I talk to a young couple, I that are looking to marry and eventually have a family, my best non-professional advice is have a conversation about if and when you have kids, how are you going to raise them?
Mm.
Because that is sometimes a big surprise to a lot of couples when one uh, partner says, "Oh, I want to raise them this way," and the other partner says, "No, I'm thinking this way," and then it's like, "Oh." and that was never discussed.
Right.
Uh, but what is your view in today's society, being that there's all kinds of, as you mentioned before, different sorts of relationships and different sorts of couples and different sorts of families? What's your best advice to people that are starting off or people that are already there and have kids as how they could make their family and their relationships healthier?
Well, you're touching on really the crux of it, which is communication and being able to have conversations about things that we can know are important to us, like child rearing. Some of these things we might be able to anticipate, whether or not you even want to have children. So, having those sorts of conversations. But I also think it's impossible to troubleshoot what life might put in front of you over the course of a long-term marriage. So there have to be some foundational things. And I think the best way to develop those are to really spend time with each other, getting to know each other, and to make sure that you choose a partner that you really like and that you have a solid and strong friendship with. And then on top of that, being able to communicate, being able to talk about even the tough stuff, maybe that more importantly than anything else.
Doesn't that take a sort of maturity between both uh, partners in order to do so?
Yeah, I think it does. I think it does. So, um, you know, I know I married quite young and didn't have an understanding of really what I was committing to. So I think maybe waiting a little longer to make that sort of commitment is not a bad idea. Although we hear all the time of people who have been married for 60 years or longer and met and dated for 6 weeks and got married and were
That doesn't
19 years
necessarily
old.
make them happy, though, right?
Well, that's true. So that's a distinction
Right,
also, in that longevity doesn't necessarily mean that it was a happy connection.
right.
But in terms of people who are embarking on becoming a married couple, um, I think making sure that you are able to communicate, and if you can delay that until you're able to do that, then that might be a good marker of whether or not you're a good candidate.
Well, that makes perfect sense. Laura, thank you so much for joining us today on the Manny Gomez Show. I think we learned a lot of great things today from Laura and her professional background in relationships, in family relationships. Uh, Great takeaways: communication, number one, matureness, delay if you need to, and overall, just understanding of each other and understanding what you're getting yourselves into or what you may already be into and how you could make it better. So, again, thank you, Laura, for joining us today. And thank you, folks, for tuning in. More to follow next week.